Brazil was inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The earliest evidence of human habitation in Brazil dates back to about 11,000 years ago. According to many historians, it is estimated that around 1500, there were about 5 million indigenous people living in the area.
These people were divided into numerous tribes, which were formed with a lifestyle suitable for their surrounding environment. It is said that each tribe endured hardships for a long time, forming relationships with neighboring tribes in various ways, sometimes at war and sometimes as allies.
However, at the end of the 15th century, the opening of the age of exploration in Europe, spearheaded by Columbus, meant that completely new history would begin in this region as well. During the age of exploration, which began with the goal of finding a new trade route to India, Spain aimed to explore westward, while Portugal focused on eastern exploration. Two former rivals signed a new treaty at Tordesillas in 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas resolved the dispute by giving Spain all the lands to the west of a dividing line, and Portugal all of the lands to the east. The treaty also stipulated that any lands discovered in the future would be divided in the same way. However, up to 1494, when the treaty was signed, the existence of the Brazilian region was not yet known. So after Brazil became a Portuguese colony, the fact that Portuguese, rather than Spanish, is still used in this region was largely coincidental. On April 22, 1500, a Portuguese man named Pedro Álvares Cabral arrived in Porto Seguro, Brazil with 13 ships, and the new history of Brazil began in earnest. Cabral, who arrived in the new land, soon unilaterally declared this land to be the territory of King Manuel I of Portugal without asking the opinions of the natives. The region was given the name Brazil, derived from the name of the material that would emerge as an important export product before other products to come, the Brazil wood tree. The wood of the Brazil wood tree, although not as lucrative as other species, could be easily commercialized in the early colonies with relatively little labor. To achieve this, the Portuguese distributed tree-cutting tools to the indigenous people from the beginning and relied on their labor. For the first few years after Cabral first landed in the area, relations between the natives and the Portuguese were relatively peaceful. The Portuguese, who were an absolute minority, desperately needed the help of the indigenous people to live in the new land. However, even after the existence of the new continent became known to Portugal, Portuguese migration was not active for the first few decades. The King of Portugal divided the Brazilian coast into 12 districts and distributed them to the upper class, including nobles, granting them various privileges. However, no settlements emerged in 4 of these districts until the 16th century. There was great aversion to the completely different climate, fear of new diseases, and living among unfamiliar natives. Eventually, in the late 16th century, the royal family, who wanted something to change, decided on what is now Salvador as the capital of the new colony and began directly leading development policies, and full-scale migration began. However, the fact that the king himself began to lead the development and migration policy of the colony was bad news for the indigenous people of this region. The Portuguese colonization of Brazil had a devastating impact on the indigenous people of the region. Many indigenous people were killed or enslaved by the Portuguese settlers. Others were forced to convert to Christianity. The Portuguese colonization of Brazil also led to the destruction of much of the Amazon rainforest, which was the ancestral homeland of many indigenous peoples. As the Portuguese began to focus on developing new products other than wood, sugar began to attract attention, and unlike wood, this required a large scale of labor.
Because of this, the Portuguese soon began enslaving the inland natives. In addition, because sugar production required high-quality land, the Portuguese soon began unilaterally taking over the land where the indigenous people lived. Naturally, the natives resisted, and in 1558, 130 native villages were destroyed in the process of suppressing the natives' resistance. The native culture was now seen as barbaric, and the natives were regarded as savages who needed to be converted by missionaries.
In addition, as the Portuguese began to migrate in earnest, they caused the death of many indigenous people who did not have antibodies to infectious diseases such as measles and smallpox. Because of this situation, the enslavement of indigenous people was banned by Portugal, the colonizing country, in 1609. However, the Portuguese in Brazil strongly protested against this decision, saying it was completely ignorant of the local economic situation, and the measure was eventually withdrawn 2 years later. Indigenous people were already disappearing from major coastal areas, so Portugal began importing slaves from Africa to supply new labor.
In 1574, 90% of slaves were natives, but by 1638, 100% had been brought from Africa. It is estimated that approximately 350,000 African people were brought to Brazil as slaves during the 17th century. Most slaves who arrived in Brazil died after an average of 7 years due to malnutrition, poor working conditions, and abuse. These harsh working conditions worsened when gold mines were discovered near Rio de Janeiro in 1695. The discovery of gold mines had a significant impact in other ways as well. Before the discovery of gold mines, few Portuguese people lived in the south, including Rio de Janeiro. However, in just 25 years, there was such an explosive migration that about half of the Portuguese who settled in Brazil lived in this region. At the beginning of the 18th century, an estimated 2 million Portuguese people lived in their home country, but about 400,000 emigrated to Brazil during the 18th century. There were a number of reasons why so many Portuguese immigrated to Brazil during this period. One reason was the discovery of gold and diamonds in Brazil in the early 1700s.
The discovery of gold and diamonds in Brazil in 1700 led to a population boom in the country. The population of Brazil increased from around 300,000 in 1700 to over 3 million in 1800. The discovery of gold and diamonds also led to Brazil surpassing Portugal economically. Brazil became a major producer of gold and diamonds, and these exports brought in a lot of money for the Brazilian economy. This was a strange phenomenon because it was unusual for a colony to surpass its colonizer economically. However, there were a few factors that contributed to this in Brazil's case. First, Brazil was a very large and resource-rich country. The discovery of gold and diamonds was just one of the many resources that were found in Brazil. Second, Brazil had a relatively small population compared to its size. This meant that there was a lot of land and resources available for each person. Third, Brazil was located in a strategic location. It was close to the major trade routes of the Atlantic Ocean, which made it easy to export its goods. The discovery of gold and diamonds in Brazil had a profound impact on the country's history. It led to a population boom, economic growth, and a change in the balance of power between Brazil and Portugal. The gold rush also led to the development of new cities and towns in Brazil. These cities and towns were built to house the miners and their families, and they became important centers of trade and commerce. The gold rush also had a social impact on Brazil. It led to the rise of a new class of wealthy landowners, and it also led to the growth of slavery. The gold rush was a major turning point in Brazilian history. It helped to shape the country into the economic and political power that it is today. Stay tuned for part 2 of the dynamic creation of Brazil as we continue our captivating journey through Brazilian history. Thank you for watching the video, The Dynamic Creation of Brazil, Part 1, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, Cindy, Helena, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.